Today is October 7th, 2024. It is a day we all dreaded. And once it is upon us, here we are. 1 year later, still as stunned by the savagery that tore asunder everything we thought we understood about life and the countries and world in which we live. I am not a morning person, but today I woke up at 6:30 a.m. on the dot, which is more than a little eerie, because 1 year ago, red alert rocket alarms began sounding across southern and central Israel at 6:29 a.m. A few hours after waking, I decided to head to the site of the Nova Music Festival, where hundreds of young ravers were raped, tortured, and slaughtered 1 year ago. Many were taken hostage by Hamas, and many remain in captivity. The drive to the Nova site, right by Kibbutz Re'im, usually takes about 20 minutes from my home in the south. Today, the roads were jammed. At random spots along the way, families and friends gathered in impromptu memorial services. Signs reminding us of the hostages were everywhere. The police presence was beyond overwhelming. Road 232, which I travel from my kibbutz to the Nova site, was lined solidly on both sides with cars. It was darkly reminiscent of what the road must have looked like 1 year ago, except that by noon on October 7th, 2023, every single vehicle on 232 had been burned by Hamas, often with drivers and passengers inside. Many were shot before being incinerated. Most were burned alive. The experience at the Nova site today was extraordinary, and I will share that with you in the coming days. I simply was not prepared for what I encountered. But for now, we bring you a special podcast for October 7th. First, I speak with my good friend, Amir Tibon, who is also an exceptional journalist and the author of the recently published book, Gates of Gaza, about his harrowing experience 1 year ago at Kibbutz Nahal. Amir discusses with us what life is like 1 year on, his hopes for the future, and his deep concern for his friend and neighbor, Tzachi Idan, who is still held hostage by Hamas 1 year on. The discussion with Amir is followed by an interview with Adam Ma'anit and his wife, Heidi Bachram. They live in Brighton, in the United Kingdom, with their teenage daughter. Adam is also the first cousin of Tzachi Idan. He and Heidi have been advocating for Tzachi's release, along with all of the hostages. We start now with Amir Tibon. I spoke with him last Thursday night. Also, in the program notes, you will find the interview I did with him last November, in which he gives detailed testimony of how he and his young family hid in their safe room in their home on Kibbutz Nahal until they were rescued by his father late in the afternoon. Hamas terrorists tried several times to break into the Tibon family home. It is a harrowing but important story, as is each episode from that day and since. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and now trying to remember what life was like when morality was so much clearer in the state of Tel Aviv and beyond. Stay with us. It is Thursday night, just after 9 p.m. in Israel, Thursday, October 3rd. Good to see you, Amir Tibon.
Hi, Vivian. Good to see you, my friend.
And thank you so much for making time to speak about what is not an easy topic, October 7th.
We have to keep talking about it, even if we don't always want to.
Incessantly. You had last year what can only be described as a wildly harrowing experience, and that's still an understatement. We are going to repost your testimony that you gave to State of Tel Aviv a year ago in full, but we are here now. A year later, you have been living with your wife and two young daughters and temporary housing on a beautiful kibbutz in the north, but it's not home.
Yeah.
And you've written a book, and you have been a very busy guy organizing protests and demonstrations and keeping awareness high for hostages and the displaced. Where are you today, a few days before October 7th? Where are you at in your head? How are you understanding what happened then, what's happened since? And of course, today, we in Israel are in a very precarious position.
First of all, physically speaking, my family, like you said, has been in a kibbutz Mishmar HaEmek, which is a community outside Haifa. And we've been there since October 8th. They've been hosting us very generously. And it's become our home away from home, in a way. At first, for half a year, we lived in little rooms over there, basically dorm rooms. Each family got a tiny little room to share. At the end of April, we were upgraded to caravans that were brought on site for us. And now each family has a little caravan with 2 bedrooms and a little kitchen, and it's much better than it used to be.
And a caravan for North Americans is like a trailer.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Like a little trailer. Exactly. We're okay in that sense. Our physical needs are being taken care of. Still, the main issue for our community, like all the communities that were attacked on October 7 and had hostages, the main issue is that we still have people over there. We still have 2 friends, Amir and I and Tzachi Idan. Both of them are fathers of young children. They're in their 40s, and their families are with us, and they are not. And this remains the most difficult issue for communities like Nahal, communities like Be'eri, Kfar Aza, because the whole process of healing and rebuilding and reconstruction and rising from this disaster is being hampered by the ongoing reality of having to fight for the hostages, having to keep their situation in the public awareness. And it's not easy, Vivian, because there's so much going on in this country. As you know, we are now fighting a war in the north against Hezbollah. We have casualties there almost every day. We are about to make a dramatic move against Iran, which I think is long overdue, but we will finally be doing it probably in the coming days. Iran made a serious miscalculation when it fired those ballistic missiles at Israel a few nights ago, and Israel seems set to take some significant action. So all of that is very important. I'm not discounting any of it. And yet it seems to us that on some days, the issue of our hostages and the fact that we have 100 people there, approximately half of them are alive, it's being forgotten. And we feel like we have to remind everyone that this problem has not been solved yet.
It's heartbreaking. And you and I have been in contact throughout the year. You've organized, just a few months ago, you organized a very powerful 3-day protest in the area around the Gaza Strip, where your home is and where so many people lived until October 7th, to continue to work to bring attention to this. I think, and I know that many Israelis feel the absence and what I will call the betrayal and abandonment of the hostages profoundly.
Yes.
I do feel that we have betrayed, in many ways, the soul, the founding ethos
The DNA.
of the country.
Yeah, the DNA of what it
Exactly.
is to be Israeli.
Exactly. And if you do not have that absolute confidence and trust that your government and your army will do everything possible to rescue you, then what do you have? But what I wanted to talk about is Tzachi Idan.
Yes.
Tzachi was your neighbor on Nahal Oz,
Yeah.
is in captivity. I will also be speaking today with his cousins in the United Kingdom who have been fighting tirelessly and brilliantly for his release. How is his family doing?
So his wife, Gali, is living with us in Mishmar HaEmek, 3 rows from my house. They had 4 children. And then on October 7th, their oldest daughter, Ma'ayan, was murdered. This happened just a few days after she had celebrated her 18th birthday. I write about her in my book. She was a very beloved and admired teenager. She worked in the kindergarten of the kibbutz, actually worked with my girls as well. And the young children really looked up to her. And we feel her absence every day. And I think of Gali losing her daughter and then being now for a year without her husband, who is presumed to be still alive, but we are unable to bring him back. It's really difficult, especially because Everything else that is happening is important. Again, I'm not discounting anything that's happening. The war with Iran is crucial. The war with Hezbollah is crucial. We have to get our people in the north back home. But I feel like there was a moment there where we had an opportunity to go for a deal, and that was squandered. And now it is 10 times more difficult because it's not clear who is the negotiating partner in Hamas. We don't know if Sinwar is alive or not at this point. There have been all kinds of rumors that maybe his lack of communication is because he died. We just don't know. The Hezbollah leadership is completely destroyed. Who do you make a deal with over there? And of course, we are about to go after the Iranians, which again, I think is great. But what about our people?
So I want to get to our government in a moment and letting that opportunity pass. And I will offer up, I think that all eyes should be on and all fingers should be pointed at Qatar.
That is an important and true assessment. And again, we never, throughout this war, we have never put real pressure on that.
Nothing.
Nothing.
I've never understood why America did not, on October 8th, freeze all their assets.
I think in the beginning of the war, the Americans did put a lot of pressure on Qatar, and this contributed significantly to the first hostage deal of November. But in that hostage deal, in a way, Qatar reinstated itself as the trusted partner to work with Hamas. And ever since then, nobody's been putting any pressure on them. And this is a very difficult situation.
Yeah, and let's not forget that in that period as well, the United States chose to renew its lease for its military base in Qatar, which is the largest in the Middle East.
They're a very smart actor. They know what they're doing. Much smarter than the Iranians, for example, who completely botched this entire year. What they did in the last 2 weeks has just been incredibly stupid.
Unbelievable. There was that moment of intense optimism. It was from
late May, early June.
Things were very active, and I went to many events in that time. And then we started to feel it fall apart early July.
Yes.
And remember, that was when all of the heads of our key security and intelligence agencies, head of Mossad, head of Shin Bet, the IDF chief of staff, and minister of defense, all four came out publicly in early July when Netanyahu was saying, exactly. And he kept saying, we need the Philadelphia corridor. And they said, no, we've got to get them out and we have to do it now. Unprecedented. And they've continued to hold that line. And the prime ministers continue to resist that.
Vivian, today their position makes much more sense because they knew what was coming. They knew we were about to go for the Beeper operation. They knew we were about to go into Lebanon. They knew that we may be going to war with Iran and that all of these things will make a deal much more complicated to achieve. There was this window of opportunity. Now, we also have a big problem with Hamas, with Sinwar and his messianic, fanatic, lunatic worldview. I'm not discounting any of that. I'm not putting all the blame on the prime minister, but I think he did not do enough. And I will even say he effectively sabotaged. And he had a partner for sabotaging on the other side. 100% Sinwar, because of his messianic fantasies, believed that a regional war involving Iran would somehow play for his interests. That Iran would Israel on fire. Basically, he miscalculated. He did not understand what would be the real meaning of a regional war. But because he wanted it, he was not eager to make a deal. And Netanyahu helped him by starting to make all this big thing out of the Philadelphia corridor. What, are we going now to take over the Lebanon-Syria border so that Hezbollah never gets any weapons smuggled in there again? Are we going to take over the Yemen-Saudi Arabia border? Where does this end? The idea that you have to control any kind of corridor that separates your enemy from other countries is not a real feasible strategy. It would be great to hold on to Philadelphia in an ideal world, but in the real world, it means that we're not getting a deal. The hostages are dying in terrible suffering in the tunnels, and our soldiers along that very narrow corridor are becoming sitting ducks because they're sitting there in guard positions, and we've already lost many soldiers over there. So this is the situation.
If you can distill it, to what do you attribute Netanyahu, as you said, stalling or not moving forward on a hostage deal when the moment was right? Why do you think he did that?
Coalition politics. It's not that he doesn't want to see the hostages back. It's just that he wants to keep his government intact more. And if he and by the way, this has been true since October 8th. Nothing here is a surprise. On October 8th, on October 7th, Lapid came to Netanyahu, Lapid being the head of the opposition. and said, take out Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the extremist fanatics in your government, and I will make sure that all the Zionist parties in the opposition will join. And he was even willing to offer a full year of support. Basically, a promise to have Netanyahu's back for an entire year so Israel could run the war with a wide consensus Zionist liberal government, which is what we needed during this year. And on October 8th, Netanyahu went to several people in Likud who implored him to do this and said, I'm not giving up my 64, meaning I'm not giving up my organic, far-right, ultra-religious Haredi coalition. Because he said, what will I do when that year is over? And this has been what it's all about ever since. He refused to enlarge the coalition in such a way on October 8th. And this also drives his approach to the hostages. He wants to remain in power. He knows that remaining in power is basically means relying on the far right and the Haredi and the ultra-Orthodox. And that's where we're stuck with the hostages and with many other things that could have been done over this past year. The war in the north could have been opened months ago if we had that kind of government. The relationship with most of the important Western governments, maybe not the Canadian government, but many others, would have been much better if we had this kind of coalition. A lot of things. Of course, we would have a stronger and larger military because there would already be no more ultra-Orthodox exemption. A lot of things would have been dealt with this.
Absolutely. And we would have a much more unified population.
That is another element
and what
of
we've
it.
seen,
Indeed.
because of the way in which I think the Prime Minister has chosen to handle these many crises overlapping, the divisions that existed before October 7th, in my view, have only deepened and widened.
Although one thing that's interesting to note, I do believe that if this government will now take action against Iran, it will have broad support from the opposition. I mean, you can see even, Yair Golan, who's like on the left edge of the Zionist elements of this opposition, coming out in favor of it. Of course, Lapid, Gantz, Lieberman, they're all supportive. On this issue, I don't think there will be a big divide. We'll keep fighting about other issues, which are just as important, because Iran is an existential threat to our country from afar. And we are facing other very big, some of them existential threats from within. Like, for example, what kind of country are we going to have if we are going to keep with the current situation with the ultra-Orthodox? But on Iran, I think there will be unity.
I want to stay focused on you, your family, and your community. Monday, we'll both be in the area of around the Gaza Strip. Of course, as you know, I moved a few months ago to Kibbutz Ruchama, which is very close by. And starting in September and until December, Ruchama is integrating into its kibbutz for Gaza people. So I want to be back for that. And I'm sure we'll have commemorations and events and solemnity on Kibbutz Ruchama on October 7th. I'm interested in hearing two things. One is what you are planning with your family. And the other is, does the Nahal Oz community, who is still displaced, do you have plans to return to the kibbutz? And what can you share?
So on October 7th, there's going to be a lot of commemoration events. We are doing our main community event on October 6th, because we want people in the community to be able on October 7th to go to different cemeteries around the country where people that they were close to are having their final rest. It's important to note that in this area of the Gaza border region, people lost friends and family members, not just within their communities. If you are a long-time resident of Nahal Oz, you lost on that day also friends, sometimes relatives from Be'eri and Kfar Aza and Sderot. So people on October 7th, a lot of them will be traveling. I'm going to be in several cemeteries on that day for memorial events for soldiers who fell in the battles around our kibbutz on October 7th, and I've been supporting their families ever since, and I want to be with those families on October 7th. And regarding the future of the kibbutz, I can say that right now we have about 20 people living in Nahal Oz, which is an increase, because if we had this interview half a year ago, it was maybe 5. But we have 20 people living there full-time. Very few children. It's mostly either people without children or people with older children who are out of home. And I believe during the year it will grow a little bit. And the real decision time for everybody will be the summer of 2025. That's when our kind of agreement with Mishmar HaEmek will come to its end. And each family that currently is being evacuated there will have to decide, are we going back to the kibbutz or are we starting our life somewhere else? And I do believe the majority of the families will come back to the kibbutz. I think the security situation is improved. I think the IDF did a lot of important things in Gaza. It's never going to be perfect. Just this morning, there was a rocket alarm in Nahal Oz. The IDF said it was a false alarm, but I'm not sure. We're going to have some difficult things from time to time. It's never going to be 100%, but I do believe it's a much safer place to live than a year ago. And I think the real issue that we have to deal with is the hostages. We're coming back to the beginning of our conversation. Getting our people back from there alive will give a huge moral boost to our community, will make everybody feel much better and smile. And I really think this is what we need right now. This is what we need in order to strengthen the community and give everyone the power to go back home.
I want to ask you before I let you go, because it's been sitting in my head since the beginning of our discussion. You mentioned that Tzachi and Tzachi Idan's eldest daughter, Maayan, had just turned 18. And as I'm aware, and we've heard in your testimony and others before, she was murdered in front of her siblings and her parents.
Yes.
And she was also working with your children, your very young daughters.
In the kindergarten of the
And
kibbutz.
how do you explain to your kids, to your young daughters, what happened to Maayan?
So honestly, we haven't. We didn't tell them. I felt like they had been through so much that I just couldn't tell them about this. One day we will have to, but I feel that because they're so young, they're 4.5 and 2.5, it's still a little too early, but there are other questions we could not avoid. They have friends who lost parents. Right. We had to talk about that. We had to explain the very situation, why we, in the middle of the night, left our home and moved somewhere else and can't go back. And that's why I always say, Vivian, and this is something that anybody who will read my book will notice, that there were so many heroes on that day, and I write about many of the heroes in my book, but the biggest heroes were the children who had to go through this and live through this. They are truly the biggest heroes of this entire story, and they will be carrying it with them for many years ahead.
And I urge everyone to read Amir's book, Gates of Gaza. It's available in hard copy, soft copy, Kindle, Kobo, whatever you use to read your book. Amir, thank you so much for sharing, for making yourself available. And I wish you, your family, all of the Nahal Oz residents, and all of the people of Israel a better, safer year.
Amen. Thank you, my friend.
Now, we move to our discussion with Adam Ma'anit and Heidi Bachram. I thought that it would be interesting to introduce close family who are so deeply connected to the events of October 7th in Israel, but are also experiencing the radical and violent antisemitism that was sparked immediately 1 year ago. Heidi and Adam's insights are deeply moving and disturbing. Over to Brighton, UK now. It's late where you are. It is Thursday, October 3rd, 10:20 in Brighton, United Kingdom. Adam Ma'anit, Heidi Bachram, thank you so much for joining State of Tel Aviv.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. And for our listeners, Heidi and I first encountered one another on Twitter, now called X, and have been messaging back and forth. She is a titan, a lioness on social media, and has been ever since October 7th. So Heidi, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you and just ask you to tell us a bit about yourself, but more importantly, start with October 7th. Where were you? What happened? And what poked the lion inside you?
I was asleep in bed, and Adam had gotten up earlier because he was due to guard at the synagogue that morning, and he had to get up a little bit earlier than I wanted to get up on a Saturday. So he woke me up in a sort of panic, saying, "There's been a terror attack. There's been a terror attack." And I just groggily opened my eyes and thought, okay, it's Israel. There's always something. It's probably a shooting or a stabbing or a ramming or something. But his voice was different and the panic was bigger. So I felt jolted awake. And then he told me that there were a lot of people dead. And then you start to look at social media, and then it gets worse and worse.
We wear stab vests in anticipation that we might have a terrorist attack or incident and to protect ourselves. I was putting on my stab vest. I actually wasn't listening to the news. I didn't check my phone unusually that day. I was just in a kind of good mood, and I was just listening to kind of music.
Adam seemed to have a sixth sense that hell was about to break loose. He said he took his time that morning, drinking coffee, took the dogs for a walk. He didn't check the news or his phone, which was unusual for him. It was as if he knew to allow himself to enjoy these last moments of tranquility. When he did look at his phone, it was alight with alerts and bad news. Very bad news. He went to the synagogue where he was working as a security guard. And in his words, the gathering that morning became like a giant crisis session. In the small community of just over 2,000 Jewish people in Brighton, many are from Israel or have family there. The shock was palpable. Heidi explains.
I think what happened as well was that the next day, while we're getting all this news coming in, we do have quite a big problem with antisemitism in Brighton anyway. So like far left antisemitism, which has been ongoing for many years. And that was something that we were involved with fighting already. So we were quite well aware that there was a problem here, but it didn't prepare us for quite how awful things were going to get quite quickly, like literally overnight. And instead of seeing any kind of pause or reflection in terms of what the horrors that had happened in Israel, what we saw was the opposite. We saw an escalation, but we also saw a celebration. So the next day, on the Sunday, there was a rally for Gaza in Brighton before Israel had responded at all, while terrorists were still roaming and slaughtering people. And that situation was by no means under control. And we had already known there were at least 500 civilians dead by then and all sorts of horrors and kidnapping. We hadn't found out about Adam's family at that point, but Adam went to town and he was in town and he saw this rally and he filmed it because he was like, what are they going to say? What are they going to do? Because the atmosphere on that rally was jubilant. And it wasn't a rally to be fearful about what might come from Israel. It was a rally to celebrate what terrorists had done to Israelis. So there was a woman there who got on the megaphone, and she was a British Palestinian student. And she literally said those words, that it was beautiful, that it was inspiring. She was giddy with it. And then when Adam got home, we didn't have time to even look at the video or what. He just said that there was this awful rally. And then it wasn't until the evening that I actually had time to look at it. And then I saw this woman saying these terrible things. And it was like an electric shock, like the shock of the terror attack. But then this, like in our city, this person supporting these terrible atrocities. And I just had to do something. So I put a clip of it onto Twitter. And I didn't have that many followers, a few thousand, just because I'd been working on antisemitism for a few years. Nothing huge. But that clip, I think it captured that terrible feeling that British Jews were having, and actually British people were having, that the supporters of these atrocities were amongst us. And there it was for all to see. And they weren't just amongst us. They were on a megaphone shouting as loudly as they could on the streets of a city that's supposed to be tolerant and inclusive. So I think it horrified the nation. And that clip, I think it was like 11,000 likes and like 1 million views. Like it was the biggest tweet I'd ever had, because I think it really captured that moment and that fear and that feeling. And it generated a lot of national press, and she was eventually arrested, and now she's charged and in court. So it was the first case since October 7th that was about Hamas and supporting Hamas, because it Hamas had just been prescribed in its entirety only a few years before, and this was one of the bigger cases of that, breaking that law.
As horrible as things seemed, everything became much worse for Adam and Heidi very, very quickly when they learned on that Saturday that Adam's cousin and Amir Tibon's neighbor, Tzachi Idan, had been taken hostage by Hamas. And there's more.
Adam, I want to take you back to that very dark and still surreal day. It's amazing, isn't it, that we're almost to the day a year away. And aside from absorbing the news and this horror that's going on, you also have a cousin who was living with his family at Kibbutz Nahal. Can you tell us a bit about what happened and how you found out about your cousin?
Yeah. So Tzachi is the same age as me. He's a few months younger. He turned 50 in April, yeah. He and I visited, when I visited Nahal as a teenager, he and I would argue about which Led Zeppelin riff was the best, or we'd play football and we'd eat sabbath and we would do what teenagers do. He was very much from that community, though. That was his world, and his family in particular are his world. On the day of the attack, of the Black Sabbath, we call it in Hebrew, all of the kids, at 6:29 a.m., they hear the rocket sirens. The kids are in the mamad, in the bomb shelter, sleeping. The rest of the family come in their pajamas. Family all pile in to the bomb shelter. Tzachi and Gali are the parents, and then they have 4 children, but 3 of the children were at home. Fortunately, Sharon was in Tel Aviv at the time, but their eldest, Mayan, 18, Yael, 12, and Shachar, 9. Mayan's birthday is today, as we speak. She would have been 19 years old. She didn't make it to 19 because she was murdered while they were in the bomb shelter. What happened was they heard the rocket sirens. They assumed it was a normal rocket thing, and of course that was a normal event in that area. But it was more intense, a lot more rockets, and the WhatsApp group of the community alerted them to a possible intrusion. Then they soon heard gunfire, and then they heard the sounds of their neighbor Tomer speaking in Hebrew, asking them to come out. Tomer's a 17-year-old boy. They know Tomer, but they also knew that what he was saying was under duress. And what ended up happening was Hamas were taking Tomer by gunpoint after shooting his dad in the leg and going house to house hunting for the remaining hiding and using Tomer to lure them out. Eventually, when they were done with Tomer, they shot him, killed him, and left him for dead.
Tomer Elias, as Adam said, was a 17-year-old boy living with his stepfather, Noam Eliakim, his mother, Dikla Arava, and stepsisters, 8-year-old Ella and 15-year-old Daphna Eliakim. The Hamas terrorists live-streamed the family's final moments as they were tortured, terrified, shot, and taken hostage. The 2 girls were taken together to the Gaza Strip and held captive until November 26th, following 51 days in captivity. Initially, the sisters were held in private homes, but they spent much of their captivity in the Hamas tunnels. The terrorists forced them to film a propaganda video, even 8-year-old Ella. The girls said that they were made to record the clip more than 50 times. Hamas, it seems, strives for production excellence. Once released, they moved to live with their mother. A recent television documentary showed how they are adjusting and not. Daphna said she used to hang out and walk to school with Tomer every day. She talks about being thrust into the role of protector and mother of Ella while they were in captivity, which her little sister acknowledges, saying she always made sure She ate whatever food there was, and that her big sister also comforted her when she cried. They watched as Hamas ordered Tomer to go outside on the kibbutz, live streaming as he was forced to lure his neighbors and friends to their deaths. His mother begged the terrorists to leave Tomer alone. Let him be. They did not. Now, back to Adam.
But they heard Tomer's voice and they didn't come out. And eventually the terrorists got frustrated and they shot through the door and they shot Mayan in the head. The lights were off, so at first Tzachi didn't know what happened, and he says, "Who got hit?" And he looks down because now the terrorists have gained entry. The light from outside comes in and they can see Mayan lying dead on the floor, her blood, her life force flowing out onto the tiles. She died instantly. Tzachi desperately tried to resuscitate her, but to no avail. It was a kill shot. The terrorists, meanwhile, had taken Gali and the two children and Tzachi out into the sitting room. They forced Gali to unlock her phone so that they could live stream the family's horror on her Facebook. And a lot of my family found out that way. This lasted hours because they stayed in there for hours. They used the house as a base. It was the closest house to the entrance, to the gate. And so it was very convenient logistically for them to be there. Eventually, they would bring our neighbors, the Miran family, into the sitting room in the Idan house as well. And the Miran family are a young couple. They only recently got married a few years ago. They met right before COVID. They have two small children. They're 1 and 3 years old. And by the end, after a few hours of this, maybe sensing that they needed some collateral, some insurance, they took Tzachi and Omri. They didn't have a pickup truck. They just frog marched them barefoot. And I guess they took the two strong men they thought they could handle walking all the way to Gaza. So they take Tzachi out with the blood of his firstborn still all over his clothes and his hands. In the Facebook live stream, you can see the shock on his face. He's completely out of it. Gali, a lioness, protecting her two children as best she could. Rockets are still flying overhead. Every time a rocket siren, you can see her telling the children to get their heads down, and Tzachi's just out of it. You can see he's gone.
When Adam refers to Tzachi being gone here, he means in a state of shock. His wife, Gali, later stated in her recorded testimony with the USC Shoah Foundation something similar, that Tzachi had always been so strong, so protective of his family, and in that moment, she saw him transform into an utterly broken man, literally bent over his murdered daughter, speechless. Gali said that she understood that she must do everything possible in this nightmare to protect the other two children. Adam continues with the story of his cousin, Tzachi, and his family.
There's a bit of the clip where the terrorists are telling Shachar, the youngest, the 9-year-old, to shut up. And Yaeli, 12, bravely speaks to them in English and says, "His sister, you killed his sister." And then the terrorists respond, "She's with your God now." So that clip became viral on October 7. It was one of the earlier clips that came out. There was the Shani Luke clip, the Noah Agarmani clip, and that one and a few others that just came out and were doing the rounds, and everyone was worried about the children and what happened to them. Fortunately, the children are safe. Fortunately, Gali is safe. Unfortunately, Tzachi is still hostage in Gaza. When they took Tzachi, Gali said to him, "Don't be a hero. Survive. Come back alive." That was the last thing she said to him before he was taken away.
Was he able to respond?
I don't know if he responded to her at that point. That's what she says. She said to him. I'm pretty sure that he was out of it, completely in shock.
Totally.
You can see it in the film. We have hours of this footage where you can just see he's just bereft.
I imagine that you must both be torn
by this nightmare that your cousin, your extended family is living through, and also yourselves.
Today's my aunt's birthday, and there's a bit in the clip of the live stream of the terrorists where the children are remarking how the balloons from her party are still up in the house. And Yaeli's kind of counting the balloons in the room. And I'm thinking about her a lot today. And I'm a bit traumatized by seeing the video because there's different clips. They had GoPro cameras on themselves as well. And so we see the moment of her death in one of those clips. And I'm trying not to think about that part, but it's really hard because it keeps flashing in my head. And I keep thinking about what it must have been like for Tzachi and Gali and the children to see. And I could see that when Shachar's crying, he's mourning his big sister. I saw Yaeli on Israeli television when she was on Lucy Al-Harish's show on Khan. She was so brave, but when she was talking about it and she just broke down and cried, I think the whole country cried with her. And I'm crying with her now. I just don't understand. I just watched Jeremy Bowen interview a Hamas's deputy leader in Doha, Qatar. They're living in the lap of luxury, and they're denying that any civilians were killed by their people, and they're denying that they were even targeted. They had strict instructions, and they're denying. And you know, Viv, this is the second teen relative I've lost to Hamas. I've lost a cousin, 16-year-old Orly. She was killed in the Matzah bombing in Haifa in the Second Intifada. And it was a Hamas bombing. The man who was convicted for ordering that bombing is a man named Hussam Badran. And he was convicted, he was put in prison, and he was released in the Gilad Shalit deal. And as part of the conditions for his release, he was deported to Qatar. And he now lives in a 5-star hotel in Doha, heading up Hamas's external operations. When I see Hamas press releases about them denying that they killed children, his face and his name are signed on those press releases.
We talk about like how we manage what's happening and the horror of it. But what we're doing, I think, is we're acting because it helps with the helplessness, because we're not military, we're not politicians, we're not powerful in any kind of way. But what it does do is help us to manage just feeling completely useless and not being able to go in there and get him and bring them all home. So we have to do what our skill set is giving us, and this is what we can do. And it also helps with the despair, because we're running fast, we're active, and people are like, how do you do it? You've got so much energy. And it's not energy.
It's imperative.
It's also trying to run fast enough so that the darkness doesn't catch us.
Yeah.
And if we stop, then we will be engulfed. And we can't do that because, like you say, they need us to keep speaking. They need us to keep them in the news cycle, because they just get forgotten so easily. I mean, in the first few weeks, Adam was constantly being asked for interviews, and he was able to do that. And that was something he can do because he's articulate and he can voice those thoughts and feelings. The attention starts to drop away, and we get people saying to us, oh, we've had too many hostage stories this week or this month, even eventually. So it's a brutal existence where you're trying to keep human beings that are imprisoned in dark tunnels interesting for the world. And that's something we end up having to do. And in that, you have to keep feeding the beast that is social media, but it is a kind of a good tool. It's the only tool we've got, because we're not journalists and we're not powerful, like I say. So it's our only power, and that's why we keep doing it.
I have to say, as one of your followers, and I noticed I thought you were a standout, Heidi, right from the get-go. You had not just a strong and articulate voice, but powerful and fearless. And that's what, for me, really distinguished you from so many others. And that's tremendous power. Have you been back, you guys, to visit the family in Israel since
No,
October
not
7th?
since
No.
October 7th. I've always said that we're either going to a funeral or to the best, biggest party in the world.
Do you know if there have been any signs of life of Tzachi?
So we had, earlier in the year, we had a video on Hamas's Telegram where they showed him, as they've done with many of the hostages, where they make them say things, condemn Netanyahu or whatever it is. And then at the end, what they did with Tzachi was they treated it like a game show. And they said, is he alive or is he dead? And they left it with a big question mark. And that inverted red triangle that is now ubiquitous is Hamas propaganda branding. And they left the question unanswered. It was a very difficult thing for us to see because on the one hand, it's horrific and they're doing basically psychological warfare on us, taunting us with our loved ones. On the other hand, it was a proof of life, and it was the first time we had any proof of life. And he looked terrible. He was pale and unkempt and bleary-eyed and thin, but he was alive. And so it was a bittersweet. That was January, early in the year.
Heidi and Adam say they know little of Tzachi's time in captivity. They have learned that he and Omri, the neighbor who was taken hostage with him, were separated at some point, and they believe that Tzachi is held alone.
I can feel the pain, Adam, as you speak of Mayan, this being her birthday, and makes it particularly poignant. I do recall her little brother in one of those clips wailing and saying, why? She just turned 18. Why? And there are no answers to these questions. 1 year on, in the midst of all this kind of madness, and you're moving and working at a frenzied pace to keep attention on the hostages, do whatever you guys can to bring them home.
Adam, like so many Jewish people, is shocked by the fury of antisemitism in the West. He is disgusted with the overt and shameless anti-Israel bias of the media. And he is incredulous at the way in which the hostages have been used as some sort of bargaining chip, which he sees as being so wrong. Just let them go, he says. A simple message that he delivers constantly, and most recently took to UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
What I said to the Prime Minister, what I said to every politician I ever meet is, if you want to really have this ceasefire, stop conditioning everything on the hostages. Stop putting the hostages as a bargaining chip. Stop pretending like everything depends on some kind of glamorous deal that's never going to happen, because Hamas doesn't want it. Hamas are holding the hostages. 101 people are still held hostage in Gaza, including a baby, including a 5-year-old child, including elderly people with medical conditions. When they found Eden Yerushalmi's body, she was 36 kilograms. It's about 77 pounds. She should be double that weight. She was starving to death. She was riddled with bullet holes. There was signs of torture and abuse on all of the 6 hostage bodies that they recovered. We know that they're in jeopardy. So I keep saying to every single person who will listen, media, journalists, whoever, the way out of this mess is to get the hostages home. That we are stuck because everyone keeps conditioning the release of the hostages on other things. You say, we need a deal, and that means a ceasefire, and then Israel needs to stop, and then we have to get to a table, and we have to work out a prisoner exchange, and that's why it's a year later. We are failing the hostages when we do that. We need to stop. We need to delink that. This is not a political issue. My cousin is not a bargaining chip. My cousin is a human being, an innocent man, a father, a husband, a son, a brother, a cousin. He loves music. His favorite artist is Yusuf Islam, Cat Stevens. This is not a man of war. He's not a soldier. He's a database technician. Just bring the hostages home to their children, to their parents, to their loved ones, and suddenly things can be unlocked. Suddenly that ceasefire that you so desire could happen. Suddenly that aid can flow. Suddenly we can rebuild and reassess and repair and heal. But we can't do that without the hostages home. We can't condition the hostages on anything else. It'll never happen. Hostages have been released without a deal. They've been released on humanitarian grounds. Every single person that's been held against their will for a year is a humanitarian issue. It is not a political issue. They are suffering. They are being treated abominably. And every evidence that we've seen from the treatment of the hostages when we've recovered their bodies or when we brought them back alive has told us that their lives are in mortal danger every single day. Bring them home.
Adam's very raw comments left me speechless, truly. When we continued, I asked Heidi if they are hopeful. Here's her response.
So I don't think that's part of our equation. I think we're one foot in front of the other. We're seeing things clearly. We see them as they are. And that's the only way that we can calculate for the next step forward. And that's the only way we can survive.
Amen. Adam, with respect to, the fact that the anti-Semitism is out there, I don't think surprised any of us. But for me, and here in my kind of hometown too, what did shock me was the ferociousness and the intensity and just how quickly it just went everywhere.
There's a pogromy vibe in the air. I'm a child of a Holocaust survivor. My mother was in hiding in a wine cellar in Italy from the Nazis and the fascists and the Ustasche and the Einsatzgruppen and all the rest. And I always thought of the Holocaust stories when they talk about your neighbors turning on you and people getting this hatred in their eyes and wanting to kill you. And that intensity of that, I've always understood that as a historical anecdote, not as something that I would experience in my life. But people are calling my daughter online a child killer. She's 15. She likes to draw anime. She's done nothing to anybody. There's something in the air, and something's been uncorked. And October 7th uncorked it. And it's a very kind of evil spirit that's inhabiting people's minds and bodies and souls and is scary.
October 7th, 2024. Thanks for listening. Today, of all days, there is nothing to add. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager, who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.